Рем Koolhaas, голландский архитектор, один из основателей и теоретиков деконструктивизма, лауреат Притцеровской премии, Золотого льва Венецианской биеннале за вклад в архитектуру, профессор Гарвардского университета, основатель архитектурного бюро OMA Office for Metropolitan Architecture. Koolhaas – один из вдохновителей и создателей Института медиа, архитектуры и дизайна «Стрелка» в 2010 году в Москве. В феврале 2018 года Рем представил архитектурную концепцию для здания Третьяковской галереи на Крымском валу в Москве.
На сцену приглашаются Владимир Познер и Рем Koolhaas.
I'll say a few words in Russian, and then we'll switch.
Okay.
Okay. Добрый вечер, господа и дамы. Имею честь.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I have the honor and I hope pleasure to interview Mr. Rem Koolhaas. I'll talk in English. So those of you who don't understand English, you have equipment for simultaneous interpretation. And then later or during the interview, you can send in your questions. And later I will pass on these questions to Rem and he will answer those.
All right. Perfect. You first came to Moscow in 1965.
67.
67. So you were 23?
Yeah.
You're right. And
Not even 22nd. 22.
22. And you were a journalist.
I was a journalist and I was a friend of somebody who invited me to come because he wanted to do an exhibition about Russian architecture.
Okay. Now, I have read that this visit to Moscow played a very important role in your becoming involved in architecture. Is that right?
Yeah, it's true.
How so? Why don't you tell me that story?
Basically, when I came to Russia, I understood for the first time that architecture was not about making shapes or making buildings even, but that it was a profession that kind of could define the content of society and that could intervene in shaping society. So it's a kind of very, in a way, ambitious interpretation of architecture. But when I saw the work of Russian architects in the 20s and 30s, I understood that that was their essence, that architecture was a way of script writing, but with buildings rather than words.
That was half a century ago, actually.
Yeah.
Have you come back to Moscow over the years?
Yes.
I know that this is it's a naive question and also a difficult question, but could you sum up, in your view, how has Moscow changed over that period? How would you characterize that change?
Well, when I first came, Moscow was, particularly if you came from a kind of sweet country like the Netherlands, a kind of really harsh country. But I also like the aesthetics of harshness, where we try to compose everything. In Moscow, totally radically different entities existed next to each other. And some things really beautiful, some things kind of really extremely ugly. And I always thought that the quality of Moscow was to accept that kind of coexistence almost as if it was nature. And I think that that quality is still there, except that maybe in the last 5 years Moscow is going in the direction of something that is better composed and maybe more coherent.
You know, I arrived in Moscow in 1952, when I was 18 years old. And over the years, it changed very slowly.
Yeah.
It did change, but it wasn't anything radical. And then suddenly, something happened. Now, when a city changes that quickly, when there's that kind of urban change, is that good? Is that bad? Is that a promise? Is that a potential? Is that something to worry about?
I've become kind of increasingly bad in terms of those kind of judgment. If you ask me what is good and what is bad, maybe 20 years ago I would know, but now I'm much more ambiguous, and I see that kind of basically in everything there are good and bad things at the same time. So I would say, yes, it is very good what happened in the last 5 years, because you can see that there is a kind of degree of public consciousness and that the public is taken care of, and that therefore the kind of brutality of the city is kind of reduced. But perhaps some of the wildness and some of the strangeness of the city has also been lost.
Is it risky at all, do you think?
Huh?
Is it risky?
Is it?
Risk. Is there a level of risk in it?
Maybe, yeah. But that is not a kind of a Russian characteristic, maybe.
All right. As you know, I'm not an architect.
No.
I think I'm a journalist.
Yeah.
And you initially were not an architect either.
No.
Do you have an architectural education?
Yeah, when I was here, I kind of suddenly decided to become an architect, and then I started to study in London when I was 25. And then I finished when I was 30.
All right. I don't understand architectural lingo. There are many things. Now, you came up with the word, the building is falling down. This is what happens when it develops very quickly, you know. You, I think, invented a word called bigness. Now, you're taking a noun, or you're taking an adjective, big, and you turn it into a noun, saying bigness. You can't do that in Russian. The language doesn't allow for it. I don't know whether you can do it in French. But what do you mean when you say bigness? Just exactly what are you talking about?
Okay, maybe I would like to talk about the language kind of before, because my career has never taken place in my own language. In other words, I'm a Dutch native, but I don't think about architecture in Dutch. I don't write about architecture in Dutch. And I think this kind of relationship between language and how I look at the world is really crucial, because I adopted maybe a kind of Anglo-Saxon persona, but I could easily adopt a kind of continental European persona also. And I would say that some of my writings is actually more inspired by the French than by the English. So I think that language is really the main driver, perhaps, of my whole thinking.
Really? My father had a very close friend who was a famous Dutch documentalist movie. His name was Joris Evans.
Yeah.
And he told me, Joris told me when I was a little boy, he said, Dutch is not a language, it's a sickness of the throat.
Many people say that, and I really hate that expression. But by the way, I knew Joris Evans in Indonesia, and he always used to say that he could not close his manchette, and would always ask my mother to close his manchette. So that's my kind of...
All right, getting back to bigness. What is bigness?
So at some point I thought that the world was on its way to fragmentation, and fragmentation was becoming also, in terms of deconstruction, a kind of very fashionable philosophical position. And in a way, I was feeling, or had an instinct, that endless fragmentation is not a kind of particularly nice perspective, and I was kind of thinking how architecture could contribute to reintegration and to reasserting the whole, the idea of the complete thing. And my experience in New York, in certain cases, gave me a kind of sense that certain things are so complex and require the collaboration of so many people and so many different professions and combination of kind of science and art, that the sheer effort of that kind of integration is an antidote or another model against fragmentation. So it's really, Bigness was for me a kind of ideal where through sheer complexity and sheer ambition we could begin to collaborate again. And I was just talking about it with an interviewer. What we see now is very interesting, because what we see is bigness again, but not in the terms of more and more complexity, but very, very large, very simple, simplistic entities such as data centers, storage spaces, distribution centers that are all getting bigger and bigger, many of them too big to actually be built in cities. We typically build them outside cities, and so we have a different kind of bigness, but without the complexity and therefore without the idealism.
So what can we do about that, and can we do anything?
I think I think that architecture used to be a profession maybe until the 70s of the last century, where if you would ask, can we do anything about it, and the average architect would say, yes, we can do this, we can do that, we can do this, we can do that. But I think that since then something has been taken away from us, and what has been taken away from us, I think, is the way in which, whether it is in China, in Russia, in Europe, in America, we have invested the market economy with the final voice about things, and therefore this whole connection to knowing recipes or knowing what to do has been eliminated, I would say, from the repertoire of an architect.
That's a pretty sad thing to say, isn't it?
It's maybe not that sad. It's not only sad, there I go again, because I think the history of architecture is also the history of a series of incredibly irresponsible ambitions.
These huge buildings that you speak about, they look all the same everywhere. To me, there's a kind of a sameness about them. I can't say, oh, this is American and this is whatever. They all look the same to me. And when we speak about this, I think about a movie that you probably know very well called A Clockwork Orange. And the question I wanted to ask you was, to what extent do you think the surroundings that we live in affect us as we are born and grow up? Do you think that, and this is not just an academic question, but do you think that if a person is born in a friendly, attractive, original urban setting and grows up in that, that person will be different from the one who grows up in these identical buildings? What do you think?
Maybe I'm the kind of wrong person to ask, because I was born in a bombed city that was completely ruined, and spent the first 7 years of my life there. And I would say I have mixed feelings about it. Yes, I think that you would benefit from harmony and beauty, but I think it could also give you a kind of false sense of existential security, and that therefore in every life there needs to be maybe a kind of cocktail of anxiety and disbelief and insecurity and creativity. I think that those areas are actually quite close together, and I think that to be too certain of your environment and to have an environment that is kind of really only affirming a kind of secure situation is probably not in the end a big blessing. And I think that this is actually an important issue because a couple of years ago I organized a kind of Biennale in Venice, and I certainly kind of realized that I'm typical generation of May '68, so I typically endorse the values of the French Revolution: liberty, freedom, fraternity, etc. And that so without really a drastic shift, we were in a kind of new situation where comfort, security and sustainability became the kind of main drivers of society. And there again I have kind of mixed feelings whether that is actually so crucial.
One of the expressions that I've read most of the interviews that you've given, and also some of the things you've written, and one thing that comes up pretty often is city of the future. City of the future. What is that? What is a city of the future? Do we know what it's like? Is Moscow going to be a city of the future?
I think that first of all, I don't know what the city of the future is, and I have also allowed myself to be kind of really incompetent about the future, and I try to be a specialist about the present, and I think that's already quite complex.
That's great.
In that sense, I have a kind of a really journalistic drive to understand the present, and I think a typical journalist doesn't speculate about the future. But of course I have some instincts.
Right, well, you've also called Moscow the only mega city of Europe. Mm-hmm. First of all, what's a mega city? And what makes it the only mega city in Europe? With cities like London and Paris and I don't know.
Well, I think that the unique thing about Moscow is it kind of single spot in an unbelievably vast territory. And although it has relationships with this vast territory, you don't quite get, it's not quite explicit. So it's relatively isolated as a city, and there's very few big cities next to it. But of course, if you look at the kind of whole kind of region between Holland, Belgium, Germany, that is all urban, and that is all a kind of urban pattern. But it has less identity, and it is less kind of historically defined, and therefore it's a kind of more open-ended condition. I think that Moscow is the only megacity in Europe, because it's the only isolated city of that scale.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. Okay, so New York is not a mega city, right?
Yeah, no.
Because New York is not isolated.
It's an urban condition, yeah.
Nikita Khrushchev, the man who denounced Stalin, was also the man who changed urban architecture in this country. Now, maybe that wasn't his goal, but he did. On November 30th, 1954, at the All-Union Conference of Builders, Architects, and Workers of the Building Industry, so-called socialist architecture was put to bed. Khrushchev criticized the Stalinist architecture with what he called unneeded curlicues and what have you, and began putting up these 5-story box-like buildings for housing, obviously. And now the plan is to knock a lot of them down. And first of all, how do you feel about that?
Basically, of course, I'm incredibly interested in the relationship between politics and architecture, and particularly Khrushchev, I think is really a key figure in that whole kind of situation, because I'm deeply admiring of what he did. The amount of housing that he created in a kind of very short time, the simplicity of that housing, and actually the quality of that housing and the open spaces next to them is for me a kind of really important paradigm, particularly because it was an articulation of a combination of intelligence, beauty, simplicity and equality. And I think that combination of activities of values is very difficult to discover today. But I also see that a lot of the kind of substance is that you can no longer maintain it, and that something needs to happen about it. I've been, for that reason, because I think it's such an important issue, been involved in the idea of preservation, which is not typical for our kind of architects, but simply to see whether through preservation you could achieve other aims or maintain qualities that you cannot recreate today. And as part of the Strelka effort that we launched, I worked with one of the students to declare one of the Khrushchev apartments where the poet Prigov had kind of worked, a UNESCO heritage site. So it was the most normal architecture with the least architectural quality, the most banal view, and we wanted to get a kind of recognition for those values.
Do you think the idea of simply knocking them down and then putting in a denser kind of architecture, do you think that's a positive?
I think that to some extent it is inevitable. I think it could also be done in the right way. I'm not saying it cannot be done, and also not saying it's not an intelligent effort, but I do hope that the city doesn't erase any evidence of that past.
All right.
Because, for instance, I think that the city of Berlin made a kind of massive mistake after the unification to erase everything that was part of the kind of communist aesthetic.
Yes.
And I think that has been really a historical mistake. So Moscow shouldn't make the same mistake.
I'd like to quote you. You said the following: "You can say so many things about the Soviet system that were bad, but in terms of public architecture, it was generous." Generous meaning?
For instance, one of the kind of strongest experiences I had as a kind of human being was to swim in the pool that was kind of created in the basement of the monument to the Third International. And it had kind of beautiful dressing rooms. You were diving under a kind of glass plate, and you would enter a kind of world of water that had a kind of really totally magical and unique world. So there were moments where of that kind of generosity, particularly when the public at large had to be kind of recognized. I think the Moscow Metro is another form of that generosity that I did admire. do admire still.
You know, traveling around Europe, I have been struck by the similarities between the fascist architecture of Mussolini, the Nazi architecture of Hitler's Germany, especially of sculptures, public sculptures in public places, and the communist architecture of the Stalinist period. I don't know why they have these similarities, but it seems to me that they do. Or do you think I'm mistaken?
It's obviously a kind of very tricky subject because I don't want to go on record to kind of admire that kind of architecture, but at the same time, I think it's also important to recognize that each of those systems, perhaps the Nazis, the least created important architecture. If you look really, really carefully, I think that Nazi architecture is on the whole more banal and more gloomy, I would say, less, but that in both Mussolini's architecture and Stalin's architecture there was at least incredible imagination.
There was. Yeah. There was indeed. It's interesting. How do you feel about preservation? Because we're talking about buildings being knocked down, so how do you feel about preservation?
Yeah, so maybe 10 years ago, I'm teaching in Harvard, and preservation was kind of something that I never thought about, and preservation, you know, any architect, preservation seemed to be the enemy or the other side of architecture. But when I really started studying carefully, it became a very fascinating domain. And one of the reasons is that, for instance, the first law of preservation was made by the French after the French Revolution. And it's very logical because if you have a revolution, you have to decide what to keep. Then the second preservation law was maybe the Victorian Industrial Revolution for the same reason. And basically, the first preservation laws, the interval between the present and what they wanted to preserve was maybe 1,000 years. The second law, it became 200 years. Then it became 100 years, and now already this interval between the present and what to preserve is getting shorter and shorter. There are even kind of things that we build ourselves that are preserved the moment we finish them. And therefore, I think that preservation is not a thing where you have to look behind you and say, let's keep that. I think in the future, you have to decide, even before you build something, whether it has the quality and the kind of solidity and the depth to be maintained over time, while other kind of buildings are more provisional. So I think that will be an important kind of separation. That's my hint about the city of the future.
But how do you go about deciding before you, I mean, I understand your point that you should start by thinking, before you build something, you should start by thinking about whether or not it's going to be something that should be there. But a lot of stuff is already there.
Well, maybe I'm a bit extreme or a bit polemical, but I think that there are certain cases where really within 20 years you have to decide in or out. And I think that domain is for me a kind of really exciting intellectual domain also. And for instance, the transformation of the garage is a kind of example.
So, all right, but if you know, what's the argument? What's the principle? It's ugly. Let's get rid of it, or you know.
Typically, that's the argument. It's
that's the argument.
So let's not care. And it's officially it's serving an higher purpose or not. So I think there's a whole value system that is driven and that kind of suggests that only important things and only exceptional things and only historical things should be kept. And that, I think, has a very negative effect, because for me it is important to preserve things so that anyone who lives in 100 years understands how we lived.
You once said, and I found this very interesting, you said open season has been declared on post-war social architecture, which is a very interesting concept.
Yeah.
You spoke about East Berlin, for instance, but in general, post-war architecture is what year? 60s, 70s?
60s, 70s, 80s, yeah.
And now the idea is to try to get rid of all of that.
Well, I think it's maybe kind of part of a collective shame. I think in those periods there was a kind of political layer and a political domain that was visibly taking care and thinking about how the population should live, and that was also dedicated to not let inequality become the dominant factor in urban life. And I think that for that reason, now that we are in a kind of situation, not only here, but basically everywhere in the kind of world, that cities are to some extent kind of monuments to inequality, then obviously this whole other way of thinking about what a city can do for population is almost like an embarrassment.
Well, look at Paris.
Plus, there is also, of course, many of those buildings are extremely stark, made out of concrete, and if you don't kind of recognize maybe some kind of refinement in detail, absolutely brutal. And I think we've become more intolerant for that brutality, and we want to, in a way, be consoled by our buildings.
The reason I brought up Paris is, Baron Haussmann, who knocked down God knows how many buildings in Paris, which before that I don't think was ever really considered to be an incredibly beautiful city. But it's after that that Paris acquires this world aura of the most beautiful city. So here's this man who knocks down half the city and then rebuilds it.
What are you suggesting?
Well, what I'm asking is that maybe...
Could we do the same thing?
Pardon me?
Could one do the same thing?
I don't know.
Or is it...
it seems that it's not all bad. Although, as far as preservation is concerned, one might say that he committed a crime.
I think one of the crucial words maybe to introduce is modernity and maybe even more important, modernization. What does modernization mean? Modernization means there is let's say an ideology that suggests that things can be improved. And it suggests that kind of basically you can live longer, your streets can be kind of planned, there is sewers that kind of take your waste, you get kind of running water, blah, blah, blah. So I think that Haussmann is one of the kind of manifestations of, let's say, an initial or almost a package of improvements combined with a kind of sense of aesthetics and in a way a very tangible intervention that for almost everybody would have kind of beneficial conditions. And I think that is the equivalent is very hard to imagine today, because somehow, if I would be kind of forced to say what would be your program, I wouldn't have a kind of very coherent package. I could imagine some kind of improvements, but I cannot kind of present myself, as a kind of author or a thinker of a kind of really radically different life and a radically better life.
There's so much I want to ask you. There are two cities that you've written a lot about. One is Lagos, and the other is Palermo. Okay? Now, when you speak about Lagos, you say this: Lagos contradicts almost every defining feature of the modern city. Yet it's a city that works. Okay? What is a city that works? What do you mean by that? A city that works. Or give me an example of a city that doesn't work.
Okay. Let me start with Lagos. Basically, Lagos was supposed to be the kind of most dysfunctional kind of city in the world, a dangerous city in the world, and I went to see it, at the end of kind of really ruthless dictatorship, when basically the whole public sector had disappeared. And so it was a free-for-all, and it was complete and utter chaos. And to the extent that it had once been a kind of city with an infrastructure and a kind of vision of what a kind of modern city should look like, all of that was completely gone. Yet 16 million people used it as a tool to not improve their life, because that was but to survive. Yeah, and to kind of somehow, out of this completely broken machine, extricate and create kind of pockets of maybe sanity, or pockets of energy, or pockets of intelligence, or pockets of imagination to survive. For instance, and I think what I really discovered is that in cities like Moscow, maybe in one day we have to take 200 decisions. But at the most, where to go, whether to take a taxi. But in a city like Lagos, you had to probably take 20,000 decisions that each could have a kind of really radical effect on your life. So it simply enabled me to really stretch the kind of understanding very much of, and not to be judgmental and say, okay, it's bad, it doesn't work, it stinks, but to see, to what extent under those conditions a city still offers.
You call Palermo an incubator of the global problematic. Excuse me, I'm not going to answer that. An incubator for the global problematic, an ideal blueprint for the Mediterranean and Europe as a whole, because it...
I should say we have an office with 8 partners. This is a statement by one of our partners who actually is from Palermo.
Yes.
And who is, but I of course completely endorse it and kind of also believe in it. Palermo is not comparable to Lagos, but it is to some extent an almost unique collection of very problematic European conditions, and also of very persistent European hypocrisies that come together there, and that it has a kind of it's very lucky to have a very creative politician as a mayor, who is basically able to read many of those features in a positive rather than a negative way.
All right, we're going to move away from the city for a minute and go to the country. You have an upcoming exhibition in the Guggenheim, which is called Countryside, Future of the World, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So how is the countryside future of the world? Because the view I've always had is that gradually the countryside has, in a way, become much smaller, because once upon a time the majority of the population lived in rural areas, and the population of cities was much smaller. And then there's been this movement with industrialization and all the rest of it. And now it's about 50-50, but in developed countries, many more in cities than in the countryside. So how can the countryside be the future of the world?
Well, I became aware of a kind of serious paradox that kind of basically ever since this kind of statistic of 50-50, we have overwhelmingly looked at cities and kind of celebrated cities and argued about the unique effect of and abilities of cities to lift the economy, to lift the kind of population. This morning was kind of one big advocacy of the kind of city, and what is then, if you listen to it, kind of really very noticeable is that the city is, the countryside is completely absent from that discussion. And so I simply made a very simple observation. Yes, maybe 50% lives in cities, but the other 50% still lives not in cities, lives in the countryside. And so I became fascinated by the simple question, what is happening in the countryside? And once I started looking what is happening in the countryside, and actually these are the sites where we are looking what is happening in the countryside, I realized that cities are relatively stable, because if you look, not in this case, of course, fortunately, this is brand new, but if you look out of the window, everything has been there for 200 years. And if you look carefully, and this is what I wanted to understand, this is Russia 100 years ago.
Yes.
And it's a kind of beautiful, coherent, tasteful, and this is Switzerland 100 years later. And you see that this radical change, what has changed? It's globalization that has kind of put its tentacles everywhere. And I simply find it interesting to forget about the city for a while, not as an architect, and to focus on the changes in the countryside. And what we discovered, you could say, is that in order to maintain the spectacle of the city, in order to kind of maintain the kind of feeding of the city, in order to maintain, in certain cases, the energy of the city, the countryside is becoming kind of more and more structured, organized, and Cartesian. And that sounds kind of difficult to understand, but if you look at agriculture in America or agriculture in the Netherlands, it is now based on digital data that it kind of receives from satellites that are transferred to a laptop, that the information of a laptop is transferred to an automated tractor, blah, blah, blah. So for many, many reasons, the countryside is transformed in a completely unrecognizable condition, and I simply want to...
So that's why you call it the front line of transformation?
Yeah.
Well, then tell me this. Do you think that presents new opportunities for architects, for instance?
Of course, but since we were so uniquely kind of obsessed with the city, I think we need to kind of really make a serious effort to connect to those developments.
Do you see
I think that kind of, for instance, there are in the countryside kind of, let's say, farms or farms that don't work with daylight anymore, that work with artificial colors and artificial everything. If you here, this is the image. If you look here, this is a kind of very strong architectural impression with which none of us in this room has anything to do. And nevertheless, it's kind of fresher than anything we do. So for that reason, I think it's crucial that we find a way to connect to it.
Is there a link between climate change and...
This is where I grew up.
This is what?
Where I grew up.
Oh, this is where you grew up?
Yeah.
Not very attractive. No. The fact that, for instance, permafrost is receding in Siberia, which may add more rural land and so on. Is there a link there about that's tied to what you say about the new frontier in a way?
Permafrost is kind of really a crucial kind of part of what we're looking at, and kind of Russia is a crucial country. And yes, it is true that the melting of permafrost is something that hasn't even been kind of thought or included in the kind of Paris Accord. So it's just like airplanes or shipping, a kind of big unknown that we somehow haven't addressed yet. And yet, if it continues as intensely as it is already kind of operating, there will be unbelievable kind of quantities of methane, mercury, blah, blah, blah. And so I don't want to give a kind of apocalyptic kind of story, because I think that's boring and irresponsible, but the transformation, but also the apparatus of scientists that is beginning to look at it kind of finally, and also the slowness of the understanding of that phenomenon, but also the history that the Russians have already since the 17th century to look at it and to look at its transformation, is really opening for me a completely unknown territory and very crucial territory.
I was very intrigued when I found out that you are involved in working on the new Tretyakov Gallery.
Yeah.
Now, I happen to think that it's one of the ugliest buildings I've ever seen. And if I could, I would blow it up.
Okay.
All right. But I can't. So
Yeah,
fine.
you still have an opportunity.
But yes, I know. But I'd like to ask you, what attracts you? What are you doing there? What is it about this building that you find interesting?
Well, I mentioned in the beginning that for me the exciting thing about the Russian interpretation of architecture was to see it as a kind of form of script writing by other means. And if you look at the architecture like that, then kind of basically every square meter is a kind of potential invitation to change something or to write. Let's say a square meter of architecture is like a white page of a novel. And this building happens to be an enormous building, and so therefore it is without making the effort or the expense of creating a new building out of nowhere. It simply has an unbelievable potential for accommodating more activity, richer kind of combinations of activity, and also I think a degree of experimentation with how you can interact with art, how you can combine art, how you can experiment with art, that, you know, if you would start from scratch, you could never achieve at the same scale. So that is, you know, a practical reason to save it. And then if you actually know the history of the architects, their ambitions, it's a building that out of all people is inspired by the Ducal Palace in Venice. You would never guess it, but there it is. So I think that, you know, apart from simply being perhaps ugly or not deeply appealing, it has a history that in itself compensates for that lack of beauty, maybe.
When you say that something is not worth saving if it doesn't have a function, doesn't everything have a function? I mean, even the ugliest statue has an aesthetic function. No?
I'm not sure what you're kind of referring to.
When we were talking about preservation,
Yeah.
you preserve, or rather, there are things that are not worth preserving.
Yeah, I think that there are kind of many things. For instance, it depends what you want to do. If you want to do a museum, then you have to introduce dimensions that are welcoming. It's a kind of very simple thing. Today, to create dimensions that are welcoming is very expensive. So if you start from scratch with a museum, you would have to kind of compress it and kind of make it smaller. But if you find something that already was welcoming and that has the kind of conditions to be used in a different way, I think for me, it is an exciting transformation to work with that.
Is to you function more important than beauty?
No, but it's, I don't know, I don't want to either complain or kind of involve you in too much kind of architectural kind of either jargon or, but there is a fundamental consideration or interpretation of architecture today for which the word star architect, which is a word that I can really hate on every level, has been used and which kind of suggests that architects are invited to display the full force of their imagination to create an exceptional work, which I find, as a method, deeply repulsive. And so for me, preservation is also an interesting field to create a kind of camouflage.
You've been to Hong Kong?
Yeah.
Okay. You remember those huge buildings, thousands of apartments, probably very small. I've never been inside.
Yeah, I have.
But they remind me of some kind of kingdom of the ants, millions of people boxed up inside. Now, can we say that they have a function? I suppose we can, but it's a terrible function, isn't it?
Frankly, I don't think so.
You don't?
No. It's very cheap housing, and there are many people with it that are not rich in Hong Kong, and those apartments enable them to live in Hong Kong.
All right.
Sorry.
No, I'm fine. But look, let me give you a quote from yourself. I have an instinct that what the 21st century has to offer is this post-human architecture. This is a new sublime, a landscape totally dictated by function, data, and engineering. The scale alters, the human becomes almost irrelevant. We are in a moment of transition now in a half-human, half-machine architecture.
Yeah, so I think that just to reassure you and the audience, I think there will always be a kind of place for human beings and also a kind of role for architecture to accommodate and make human beings happy. Living is a kind of very obvious example. But what I'm saying is that, let's say the last avant-garde or the last kind of moment of a breakthrough in architecture was kind of perhaps in the beginning of the 20th century. I think we are facing a kind of similar moment where, in addition to all the architecture that we make for human beings, we are also beginning to make architecture for the new conditions that we are creating. The whole morning was all dedicated to digital kind of world, smart kind of cities, self-driving kind of cars. In all those environments and all those conditions, there is at least an equal importance to accommodate machines and to think about how an environment where machines are perhaps more important than the kind of human beings that supervise them, all of that is new in the classical sense of the word. So we haven't explored it, we don't know what it means, but it is new, and I welcome newness in my profession.
Well, I'm going to ask you what is probably going to be the last question of this conversation. Before I do that, are you okay with people asking you questions?
Yeah.
Okay.
Love.
I've got them here.
Okay.
Again, very modern.
Okay.
I don't even see the person, but anyway, the question I wanted to ask you is this. Although you said you prefer not to talk about the future because it's who knows what the future is, instinctively, are you optimistic about how things are going to develop, or are we gradually destroying ourselves?
thanks to a kind of really early and efficient kind of redesign, I'm optimistic. So it's a kind of self-engineering that I kind of performed when I was 20. And from that moment, I was officially optimistic.
Good. Nice to hear. All right, well now a few questions from the audience, okay?
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, here's the first question. Do you believe that it's possible to implement modern co-living conceptions in Russian cities, especially after releasing from communal apartment system? You know what the communal apartment system, right?
This is in a way why I'm so kind of sympathetic to Russia and to Russians, because I think you've experienced so much more than other countries, and that is kind of such a luxury that you can even ask this question. Because we would be too clueless to even make the connection. So I think that yes, it is definitely kind of possible, but you are probably also warned and cynical enough to be skeptical about it.
Well, being skeptical is not a bad thing.
No, but it's also a deeply Russian feature.
Being skeptical?
Yeah.
Russians are skeptical.
Extremely skeptical.
Extremely skeptical. Okay, fine. But not cynical.
It's your sentence.
Okay. How do migrants change cities? In what way? And do they change cities?
Mm-hmm. Yes, of course. And I think that is the key. I don't know whether it is the key issue, but I think the period from the post-World War II situation is kind of maybe essentially the kind of moment that globalization, became intensified, and where the movement first of workers, then of refugees, and then of economic became a kind of dominant kind of feature. And I think in almost all cases I would say that the cities have benefited, or countries have benefited from that kind of immigration in terms of becoming more diverse, but also more intelligent and more experienced and less purist and less self-satisfied. And I've been an immigrant in New York, an immigrant in London, and I've seen, for instance, a city like London change from a kind of horrifyingly bigoted environment in the kind of early 70s to the effects of immigration into a kind of really sophisticated and exciting condition 30 years later, and now perhaps going back to this kind of earlier model. So if you look, for instance, at London alone, I would completely be positive about that condition.
It's an interesting question. I'm going to rephrase it, but it's an interesting one. In the past, many things were built with the concept that they would be there forever.
Yeah.
The question that's being asked is that possible today? Or do you know when you're building something that it's going to be maybe for 50 years, but you're certainly not thinking about eternity?
That is totally true, and that is actually what I was kind of suggesting with kind of reservation, that you have to almost decide on spot. I think that think that today almost not a single architect would think that any of his buildings would be built for eternity. And that is a kind of obviously very drastic change, because when I started kind of architecture, there were actually architects who would declare on the stage that we were lucky because our work was intended to last millennia. But not out of cynicism, but I think that's kind of currently a kind of really unrealistic assumption.
Got a couple of personal questions for you.
Huh?
One is very simple. I didn't know this, but supposedly you swim every day, is that right?
Yes.
Have you managed to do that in Moscow?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, in Moscow, yes, typically I do it, but not today. Today was swimming busy.
This is a more detailed one. Being so smart and successful, having so much connection around the world and impact, have you thought to change sphere and go to politics, business, development, or other spheres? Why did you stay
In architecture,
Yes.
I think that's a very good question. And I would say that the business hasn't necessarily been very tempting, but politics have been kind of very tempting for me and a group of kind of friends I have in the Netherlands. I'm a passionate European, and for that reason alone, I'm genuinely torn, because on the one hand, we see how kind of Europe, through its preoccupation with itself and with its kind of with the complexity of its architecture, is simply unable to kind of respond adequately to kind of changing international conditions. And personally, I'm deeply kind of sad that the kind of relationship between Europe and Russia is as complex as it is today, and very surprised that there is not a kind of awareness that Europe needs to be associated with Russia and China kind of in the near future, in order to form a kind of really a zone of intelligence and creativity. And so I would love to be a politician working on that message, but at the same time, I think the very nature of politics in Europe is so counter-effective that I think I've been maybe more efficient as to create propaganda for that notion than to try to implement it.
This is something you've said. Intelligence, beauty, simplicity, and quality of Khrushchev's residential buildings. And the person writes, and what do you think about their repetitiveness? Does such massive repetition bring quality to the urban environments?
Yeah, what can I say? I basically have a very high tolerance for repetitiveness, and also high tolerance for excitement. So, and sometimes I think the two are combined in one, but not very often.
I was asked to ask you, what building in Moscow, or anywhere in the world, or rather which two buildings, do you consider the ugliest and the most beautiful?
I'm super bad at kind of saying the ugliest, the best, the worst. I definitely will not. I don't know what the worst building in the world is. I think there are too many candidates to explore in a lifetime. Maybe one of my favorite, almost all my favorite buildings are Roman buildings. because I think that kind of Roman architecture has a kind of unique ability to be both repetitive and unique and generic and specific and welcoming and to be monumental and useful. So that is kind of my range of natural kind of affinity.
Do you believe that Rem Koolhaas
The answer is no.
could be replaced by artificial intelligence one day? Are you afraid of that?
I'm not afraid of it because I'm pretty confident that it's unlikely. Not because I'm so smart, but because I think everybody is so smart.
Really?
Yes.
Fascinating. I was told that today it is possible to produce with computers models of towns, like say 30 or 40 models, present them to a public, and also with other high-tech new inventions, register the emotional impact of these models on the audience, and then on the basis of that, select what you're going to build. Does that not kind of exclude the architect? I mean, why do you need an architect when you can do that?
Well, I think it's not only it's not only an issue in architecture. I think it's an issue in general. We have better and better kind of means to understand what kind of individual responses are, and I think our only kind of obligation is: do we want to make people only happy, or only to kind of indulge in their own kind of preferences, or do we think that life is maybe more challenging? And I'm definitely on the kind of side of the challenging, and so I'm confident that kind of for the time being we can kind of basically in the case of architecture avoid that kind of one-to-one relationship between an emotional response and a kind of built architecture.
Okay. Well, I guess this is pretty much it, except I'm going to ask you one thing that I will now do, and this is the last question, ladies and gentlemen. It's a quote from you. You say, in the last 30 years, architecture has been deeply influenced by the conversion of things. Thatcher and Reagan moving from a welfare state to a market economy. Architects used to be connected to good intentions, notionally at least. With the market economy, we've slowly found ourselves supporting at best individual ambitions and at worst pure profit motives. In that sense, every crisis perhaps presents an opportunity. What opportunity? Because what you're saying there basically
let's say the work of an architect is
Pardon me?
The work of an architect exists, of course, on many levels, and basically part of that statement is a kind of very rhetorical kind of statement, and obviously the situation is not as dire as that, because I could also say exactly because that situation, it has kind of forced each of us to become more personally kind of responsible for what we do, and to not make an automatic assumption that we are serving the public good, but to oblige ourselves to be on the good side of architectural efforts. So forget the rhetorics and see our profession, is constantly kind of changing and navigating through all these different conditions.
Thank you very much. It was
Okay,
a great pleasure. I enjoyed it. Thank you.